Hey everyone, this is Mathmetrics, and welcome to episode 7 of GridSchool for Bitwig 3.0. Today we're going to be covering chapter 7, which is the oscillator basics, how to do modulation like frequency modulation or phase modulation, amplitude modulation, and other interesting types of modulation of your oscillators. As with all the videos in this series, each episode builds upon concepts and techniques I've described in detail in earlier episodes. So if you haven't watched this series from the beginning, I recommend you go find my GridSchool playlist on YouTube and maybe, start from the beginning and get caught up with where we're at today. You'll find a link to this playlist in the description of this video. So again, today we're going to be talking about oscillator basics. And earlier episodes have talked about some aspects of oscillators. I gave a lot of in-depth detail of the swarm oscillator in episode 1, so we're not going to rehash any of that today. Instead, I'm going to talk about real basics. And in the previous video, number 6, we talked about ports and pre-chords, so I explained what all these input ports are doing and why you typically want this pitch tracking pre-chord on by default, so it's lit up like that. And that's what lets the oscillator recognize and respond to the note pitches coming in from my controller. So there's C1, C2, C3, middle C. In Bitwig land, C3 is middle C. So the first thing to know about oscillators is that you use these ratio buttons to control the pitch relative to the incoming note. So a C3 at 200 and whatever, 261 hertz, something like that. That's what this triangle wave sounds like at 261 hertz, C3. MIDI note number 60. But if I take this ratio control and I press the same C3 key on my keyboard, now it's an octave lower. If I kick this up to 4, it's yet another octave lower, even though I'm still playing C3. So the main thing about this ratio, if you've never used a synth that kind of sets its pitches or its root pitch or its coarse pitch by using ratio numbers, that's what's going on here. If you have an even number, it's going to be an octave, basically, kind of, sort of, up to a point. More like even multiples of 2 will be octave jumps. So if I change this number, it gets lower in pitch by an octave. If I go to 4, it's another octave down. If I go to 8, double it one more time, it's yet another octave down. Like you can't even hear that one unless you're on headphones or in a studio with subs. And likewise, if I change this first number up to a 2, now it's 1 octave up. If I change it to a 4, it's another octave up, and so on. So why would you want to use this, and why do they do it this way instead of just saying, kick it up 12 semitones or kick it down 12 semitones? Well, it's just it's a way a lot of modular oscillators work. It's a way certain instruments and other synthesizers, like for example, Operator from Ableton Live also uses this approach. There's a few Bitwig instruments that use this approach. So the advantage is you can do interesting things with ratios, like set a 3:2 ratio, and now you're playing something like a 5th or a 7th above the key that I'm actually hitting. Like I'm going to hit C3 here, but I'm not hearing a C note. I'm hearing something different. In fact, we can maybe pitch track that, maybe not. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole with you. I want to keep this video short. But the point is you can set up the oscillator to respond differently to the actual input note, and that allows you to do things like have one oscillator playing a root, another oscillator playing a 5th, another oscillator playing a 7th. So you could play a chord from a single input note just by setting up your oscillators with different ratios here. You just have to know what each one of the ratios is. I'll leave that up to you to explore. Now, the other interesting part about oscillators, they all have this. Like every oscillator has this ratio control I've been showing you. Every oscillator also has this semitone control, which is the more standard semitone range movement. And you can go all the way down 4 octaves or all the way up 4 octaves. So you can also do it that way if you prefer. You can use either the ratio or the octave to shift a note. If I go down, well, let's put it back at the center by double clicking. There's a C1, I'm sorry, C3. And if I control click and set this to -12 semitones, I'm playing C3, but you're hearing C2. So either way you prefer to do it, you can set your different pitches with semitone shifts or with ratio shifts. It's your choice. Okay, they give you that flexibility. And of course, the advantage of semitone shifts is you can do fractions of a semitone as well as whole semitones. So you can get some interesting detuned behavior or sour tuning that way. Double click to reset it. And then the other thing that all oscillators share in common is this left and right detune control. I talked about this in great detail outside of the GridSchool series, back in my normal Bitwig production tutorial series. Like the last 3 episodes I did before starting GridSchool talked about voice handling in Bitwig as a whole and also in the grid. And so this is a way of creating a simple kind of 2-voice unison. It'll create a stereo width to what's coming out of any given oscillator. Let me get rid of these so they aren't confusing you. So, and let's turn this into a saw wave because that'll be more interesting sounding when we start unising it. Okay. Saw wave. Let's make it a little deeper so it's not so annoying. Not a bad interval. Okay, that's a good one. So if I turn this up, all I'm really doing is shifting my C3 note. Is no longer really a C3 note. It's a C3 note that's been shifted 1.73 hertz faster. Okay, so it's slightly higher pitch than a C3 note. If I were to drop a tuner on here and look at it, you'd see that it wasn't quite C3. It's a little sharp now. If I make it, as sharp as possible, this is a small range. It's only 27 hertz either way. See, it's a little higher pitch now. So it's kind of like a bend, whatever. But the real use for this isn't to just make your note sharper or flatter. The real use for this is detuning for stereo. And you're not going to get the stereo signal unless you click this plus or minus button and light it up. And then if you start detuning this number a little bit, what this number controls specifically now when this is lit up is the pitch of the right channel relative to the left channel. The left channel is staying at C3, but the right channel is being detuned against it. So we can hit a sweet spot where the stereo sounds a little bit wider than before. And if you push it too far, you start getting beats and other kinds of weird behavior because of the phasing of those two square saw waves against each other. So this is how you get a simple kind of stereo width. And please go watch my other videos about voice handling because there's a lot of pitfalls when you start making sounds wide. You can mess up your mono compatibility, and those videos in my earlier producer tutorial series kind of tell you some ways to avoid that. Specifically, it's videos number 29, 28, and 27. And it's pretty much this one and this one that'll teach you lots of tricks for making a good wide unison sound or stereo detune that is also mono compatible. So just be aware this is basically for detuning and stereo width, a simple method that only has 2 voices total. Okay, so if you want to reset this, you can just turn that off and double click this to bring it back to 0. And now our sound is straight down the center and very mono again. All right, so then every oscillator, of course, has its basic shaping controls. You can skew it. On some oscillators, you can fold it like that. See how it's folding the sine wave in on itself. This is how you get more harmonics or more interesting timbres out of the oscillator. The sawtooth doesn't do a skew so much as a shape. right? It just makes it a little more sine-y, kind of, sort of a sine-saw hybrid when you do this. And then sync kind of doubles up the pitch effectively, right? Every oscillator is going to be a little different in this regard. Like the phase oscillator is really interesting. Shape here looks like skew, kind of, but it only skews in one direction, right? I can't skew in the other direction like you can with sine. You can skew it either way of the rise and fall of the waveform, but this one's just one way. And then feedback, or actually if I do format, I can actually create some extra harmonics at the beginning of the waveform, but then it has its longer, more sine-like shape at the end, right? So there's all kinds of weird, interesting things you can do that are slightly different for each oscillator. And these are controls that the designers decided gave you the most intuitive but useful kind of timbre changes to the original waveform. So here we're just listening to the sawtooth. As I shape it, see how it gets more subby with that shape, and then if I sync it, I'm actually cutting off its phase midway through here. You can see that the phase of the second waveform, it starts to do a second waveform, but then it's cut right there and starts at the beginning here. So that's what's giving me the buzzy edge to it. And if I fill it out all the way, now it sounds a little cleaner again because the phase is more or less kind of sort of stopping at a symmetrical point. Okay, so every oscillator is different. Play with these controls. That's your basic timbre. These two controls are two different ways of controlling the pitch relative to the key that you're actually, the MIDI note number that you're running into the oscillator. And this is your stereo detune or just a shift. Like you could have two sawtooths together being mixed in, and one of them is just detuned relative to the other. And that's potentially another way of getting a kind of phase shifting or detuning kind of behavior out of it. Now where it gets interesting, and this is, you know, the harder part, the less intuitive part of using the oscillators, is how do you modulate these? What are interesting ways to modulate an oscillator? So let's set this back to a basic saw wave shape. And I'm going to go to some other synthesizers for a minute to kind of give you something to compare and contrast against the way you do similar things in the grid. So let's look at Serum first, because Serum's an old standby and most of us have it. Where are you, Serum? Come alive for me, please. There we go. All right, so in Serum, you can have two oscillators, and most of the time they're running independently, and you run them in parallel into the master bus with these level controls. So this is both oscillators. Now this is just the saw oscillator on the left. And if I turn this down, turn this up, it's this oscillator, and you'll hear that more obviously if I... Right? Kind of a boring oscillator. And actually, oh, I'm so bad. I'm using a instrument selector so that I can just compare and contrast these without changing tracks and everything. So I'm sorry. Here is Serum. Here's this oscillator. We're just hearing this one. Let's turn that up a little bit. All right. And then if we turn this one down and turn this one up, it's just the saw oscillator. And it's just a simple saw. Now if we run them together, right, we're getting a blend of these two running in parallel into a mixer and just being blended together in the mixer. But Serum lets you use oscillator B to frequency modulate oscillator A. That's what this warping mode is. So now we're using this oscillator to frequency modulate, or more specifically, phase modulate this square wave. And this is just a little bit of history. The term FM, or frequency modulation, comes from, I think, the Yamaha DX7 synth once upon a time, back in the 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. And they called it frequency modulation because to your brain, that's kind of what it sounds like. The frequency or timbre of one wave is modulating the frequency or timbre of a different wave. But it's not really truly strictly frequency modulation. It's actually this, when it says FM from B, you're really doing something called phase modulation. And what you're using is the changing phase of this waveform you're using the shape of this waveform to modulate the phase of this waveform, and it still makes a very interesting result, but it's not strictly frequency modulation. And I'm making a big deal of that because it'll be important in a minute. So here's what frequency modulation sounds like. I've got this certain shape over on this modulator. I'm going to turn it all the way off so we're not hearing it. We're only hearing the saw modulator, but we're hearing it with a certain degree of phase modulation from this shape over here. Let's find an interesting sound. So this shape is no longer a simple saw wave. It's now a saw wave that's being modulated by this shape. And now if I scan through this wavetable position, watch what happens. Well, listen to what happens over here. Right, so it's the most basic sound design technique in the world. It's what all the electronic producers tend to do a lot, is, you know, use one wavetable or one shape to modulate a different signal of some sort. Now, it's a little more obvious and visible in a newer synth called Phase Plant. And I set this one up ahead of time so you don't have to watch me set it up. But basically what we have here is we have a simple wavetable that goes from sine to triangle to saw to square to pulse width, right? And you can see from these little arrows that this is going into kind of a mix bus, if you will, or an auxiliary bus. And I can control my envelope shape and the gain and send it over here, which eventually sends it down into the master. So we're only hearing, even though you see this one down here, there's no output coming out of the right side of this. Okay, so I've got two wavetables, different shapes. We're in this one, and this is the only one we're hearing right now. Now, if I take this wavetable and I say, I don't want to run it into the bus and hear it, I just want to select it and use it to modulate the phase of my other table, we can visually see what is happening with phase modulation. This is one thing everyone loves about Phase Plant, and it's great because now you can see what it's doing to the waveform. In Serum, you can't see this. In Phase Plant, it's just dirt obvious. So I've made this connection, and I've set a certain amount of phasing. And as we scroll through this wavetable, you can see visually how the shape of this table is affecting the shape of this table. And this is what's happening when you phase modulate. And it kind of looks like a blending of the two different frequencies or signals. So that's why some people still think of it as FM or frequency modulation, but at least Phase Plant more correctly calls it phase modulation because we're literally modulating the phase of this wavetable. So here's what it sounds like. And if we crank up the amount of phase modulation, it'll be even more drastic. Right, so that's phase modulation. Now, it's also very common to not modulate one complex wavetable with another complex wavetable. A lot of times it's more common, and I'm going to double click this to get rid of that mapping. It's common to use simple oscillator shapes like this sine wave. And we're going to use the sine wave, an LFO, basically, to modulate the phase of the wavetable up here. So now it's this shape at this speed that's modulating the phase up here. So that's what this sounds like, right? A simple sine wave jiggling the phase of this kind of square wave back and forth, speeding up the phase, slowing down the phase, and that's what creates this wiggle. And you can see the wiggle, right? And if I speed this up, and so on and so forth. So these are basic types of modulation we do. Now, one cool thing about phase plant, and another reason people love their phase plant, is you can use anything to modulate pretty much anything in a wavetable, which is really cool. Like, I can come down here and add a noise layer. Now, this is literally just a kind of noise. It's like white noise if I were to put this out into the master bus. But I can take this white noise and I can use it to modulate the phase of this wavetable. So it sounds like kind of pink noise garbled in with what the wavetable sounds like. And let's take it down quite a bit. Let's also remove the sine wave that's going on down below. So now we have this grainy little noisy thing happening. Right? And this is like a classic way to get nice gritty harmonics for bass music and stuff. And it's just this one noise table. If we change the shape of the noise, it's going to change what happens up here. Different types of noise. Make it more random. Where every time I hit a key, it's sort of changing the shape of this noise. So it's making it a little different every time. So the point is, phase plant has taught a lot of producers that you're not stuck with just a couple bare bones types of modulation between an oscillator and something modulating it, like in Serum. Serum kind of constrains you. It constrains you very musically. These are great ways to do modulation. I could take this waveform and I could FM it from whatever sample is loaded into the noise oscillator up here, or I could FM it from the sub oscillator, right? Or I could amplitude modulate it from the amplitude or the volume, if you will, of what's in the B oscillator. Or I could do ring modulation. I could use the B oscillator to ring modulate the A oscillator. So there's some good choices in here, right? But it's still a limited set. Whereas in a synth like phase plant, people have found crazy things to modulate other things, and not just modulate the phase, but modulate the shift value or the harmonics, or the pitch and semitone or sense. So the point of showing you this is to help you understand what we see in the grid and ways that you can think about modulating oscillators in the grid. So every oscillator has a purple button that is the phase input port. And by default, it's taking its phase from the project tempo. So this sawtooth is running at a C3. Let me back up a little bit. This isn't actually coming from the project tempo yet. By default, it's really not taking any phase input at all. It's just playing the signal at the hertz rate of your incoming note, like a C3. But if you take a different oscillator, like a sine oscillator, and you run the output of the sine oscillator into the phase, and we turn this up, let's go a little lower. Okay, so the point is you can use another oscillator to drive an oscillator, and you're effectively doing FM of B to A, FM A from B, just like in Serum. And whatever shape you can draw here is going to be the thing that's modifying or modulating the phase of this oscillator. You can also use a standard LFO type shape, like Let's use a simple LFO. Let's pick a triangle wave, and let's just draw a direct connection from the LFO out to the phase here. And now it's this triangle wave with this kind of shape, very slow, that's going to be modulating this one. In fact, it's very subtle because it's a very slow rate right now. If I change this to something like hertz, let's speed it up. Okay, so imagine using a modulator to wiggle this value up and down while it's modulating the sawtooth. Okay, you could make something musical out of that, right? Change the shape and slope of this thing a little bit. Let's try a sine wave. Same basic feel, but a little smoother. Let's try a saw wave. Let's try a pulse wave. Right, not too interesting in that one. Back to here. And I've done something to smooth it out. See how the signal out is no longer useful. There we go. It's just too fast. Play games with the phase of this. Right? Play games with the rotation of the phase. Okay, lots of games you can play. Take almost anything. Take a noise oscillator. That would be in Shaper. Nope. I should remember this. It's in random. So let's take noise and let's run it in here. Turn this way down. And now we've got this slippery, greasy kind of warble coming in from the white noise. Let's make the white noise stereo. And there's actually a subtle difference between the noise signal in the left channel versus the right channel. And it would be even more apparent if I detuned the oscillator just a little bit. Okay. We can use pink noise instead. A little bit of a different timbre. You could take a filter, you could filter this. Let's low pass it and see what happens. Right, so you can get all kinds of crazy timbres from feeding almost anything into this phase input port. And all you're doing is you're taking different types of signals, whether it's noise or slow LFO type shapes, or faster audio rate shapes coming from any of the standard oscillators. And you're taking one wave and phase modulating another wave. And you can get some great crazy sounds that way, right? Now there's another thing you can do, which is pitch modulate. What happens if we take this noise and we drag it into the pitch and okay? You don't even necessarily have to understand what you're doing. Just know you can take things and screw around with the pitch too. Let's go back to LFOs and let's use an LFO to modulate this pitch. Set that back to standard. Let's make this a little faster. Let's make this like 16th note. Let's modulate it up and down by 2 semitones by doing Control 2, Enter, so 2 semitones. It's modulated by an octave. 12 semitones. Okay, so you get the idea. You can modulate phase, you can modulate pitch. Now another thing you can do is use any kind of generator. Remember this entire row from one of my earlier videos in this series, this entire row is full of generators of some sort. And many of them will have a direct wireless kind of modulator output like we see in excuse me, the rest of Bitwig or early Bitwig. We also have things like random modulators that are just going to output random values all the time. Of course, we have noise modulators, which you could hook up to the special output port that looks like a modulator out, right? You could turn anything into a wireless modulator. So here's white noise coming out of a wireless modulator. And I could use this signal to modulate the shape a little bit and make it kind of random based on white noise. See how we have this jiggling now? Let's crank that value up a little bit. Let's click that and do this one. Now we have this unstable, jumpy pitch thing going on. All right, let's remove that. Let's try modulating this with the LFO. Take the shape and we'll modulate it backward this way. And we'll also modulate the sync. And what the hell, we'll also modulate semitones just a teeny bit. Play with the pitch. Modulate it like 20 cents up and down. Right? So the point is, anything in here is modulatable. And the only way you're going to figure out what's what is to experiment and play with it. So pretty much anything you plug into the purple port is effectively going to be phase modulation or frequency modulation. True frequency modulation is a whole different thing, so don't worry about that. It's kind of like there's linear and there's exponential, and one of them is effectively what phase modulation does. But everyone calls it FM because of the DX7 and serum and stuff like that, so it gets crazy. But the point is, you can basically modulate it in a carrier wave versus modulator way. With the purple port, you can modulate pitch. With the orange port, you can use anything that has a one of these blue wireless outputs on it. Like I could have this envelope be the modulator for one of these things by just hooking this up to, I don't know, hertz. You could have your detuned start out very wide and then shift inward as the envelope continues on. So it would start wide and then shift, pull back in towards center and less of a detune. Lots of crazy things you can try. Just hook stuff up, see what kind of sounds you get, experiment. You can modulate anything from anything that has these wireless connectors on them. And you can turn almost anything into a wireless connection by adding this one modulator out to almost anything. Like if I wanted a simple value knob, just a knob right here. And I go back to I/O, scroll over here, and I hook up the modulator out to it. All right, now I've got a knob that I can use to, let's take everything off this. I'm going to go to the outer polygrid and get rid of all the things I've assigned so far. All right, so nothing's being modulated now. I'm just going to use this one knob here, and I'm going to take this and modulate the sync value. So now, maybe I could take this same modulator and make the attack shorter, right? Maybe make, I don't know, make the pitch drop a little. That'll sound weird, but why not? And now this one knob is controlling three different things. It's controlling the sync, it's controlling the pitch offset a little bit, and it's controlling the attack time of the envelope. And you can see it visually modulating all three of those things. It's a little hard to see here, but look right here and you'll see the orange line changing. So let's make this attack a little longer. Okay, so anything can modulate anything, just like in everywhere else in Bitwig, right? And then there's a few types of direct connections you can do to, you know, modulate things in a more visible, obvious, cabled way. Like now I've got a random value modulating the phase here. So hear that change in timbre every single time I touch a note? That's because a different random value is being used every time I trigger the gate, and it's being modulated by this much. Let's modulate it even more. Well, let's modulate the pitch too, why not? Okay, all from one little random thing, and I could control the amount of randomness to some extent. No, I guess not. This is just completely non-touchable. But if I used a sample and hold instead, we can shape this randomness a little bit. Right now it's not super steppy. Let's make it really steppy. Let's make it not so steppy. Okay, so lots of fun things you can do. Just plug them into the phase and pitch input ports, or use wireless arrows from anything to directly modulate controls on the oscillators. That's it. Have fun experimenting. I think, you know, after seeing this, you could look at anything you're used to doing in phase plant or serum and figure out how to basically build the same exact type of modulation here. Oh, I guess it is, I will show you one more thing. It is also possible to do wavetables, but you're going to have to learn how Bitwig does wavetables. Basically, if you use the sampler oscillator and you set it to cycles mode, and you load a real wavetable in here with certain characteristics, it's not going to work perfect with every kind of wavetable. And then you freeze the playhead, and then you basically use this button to manually scrub the frame of the wavetable around. This is like scrubbing the frames over in phase plant, like I was doing earlier. You can use this as a wavetable, and the one thing to note about it is, unlike serum or phase plant, there's no input port for phase. So it's kind of hard to directly FM a wavetable in Bitwig sampler. Although you could pretty much accomplish the same thing, kind of, sort of, maybe, I don't know. I may be talking out my butt here because I haven't truly experimented with this yet. But you might be able to do something like use a wireless connection to modulate the frame knob directly in subtle ways, or the pitch knob, or geez, I don't know. I could be getting you in trouble by talking about this. But it's a little bit different than trying to do phase modulation in serum or phase plant. However, you can use the output of this, right? You could connect that to the input of some other oscillator, and you could absolutely 100% certainly use a wavetable in here to modulate the phase of one of the regular oscillators. So I don't know, maybe someday we'll see some sort of phase input on this, or maybe I need to poke around among my fellow scientists and see if we can figure out a way to phase modulate a wavetable directly in here. But other than that one gotcha, which might not be a gotcha, it could just be I don't know how yet, you can pretty much duplicate any kind of frequency modulation or phase modulation or pitch modulation or amplitude modulation of these oscillators in the Bitwig grid. Oh, by the way, amplitude modulation, you'd probably do something like put a level on here, put a gain volume knob somewhere in the signal path, and then if I wanted this LFO to be amplitude modulating the gain or volume, I would do it on that, right? Or if I wanted to use a different oscillator, like a sine oscillator here, and I wanted to have the sine oscillator amplitude modulate this, I could instead grab the IO modulator out and hook it up to the output of this sine oscillator, and then take this and, you know, amplitude modulate it that way. And now as I change the shape of this, it's going to change the behavior of the amplitude modulation. Slow it down. Not with you. With you. Right? Crazy stuff. You could have an LFO modulating the phase of this sine wave, which is also modulating the amplitude of this sawtooth. Okay? Anything you can hook up, anything you can dream up, you can modulate other things in crazy, crazy ways. So the basics of modulating oscillators, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.